maybe. Okay, so French and Indian War ended, and what's our big question that we're trying to deal with here? Yep. Yeah, what events led to the Revolutionary War? So after the French and Indian War ended, I gave you 4 things that sort of happened as a result of it. And 2 of them maybe are the big ones, okay, as we're thinking about what's happening, what's leading to the Revolutionary War. First off, what does King George do because he doesn't want to fight Native Americans anymore? Nope. Nope. He proclaims something. I have proclaimed this. Proclamation of 1763. Yeah, right. So Proclamation of 1763, which tells the colonists in the colonies, you are not allowed to do what anymore? Yeah.
Go west of the Appalachian Mountains.
Yeah, basically settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, right? There was a proclamation line, but kind of tracked the Appalachian Mountains. So colonists didn't like that because their big thing was they wanted to expand, get bigger, grow, and King George was telling them, stop growing, right? You can't anymore. So they didn't like that. That kind of rubbed them the wrong way. Kind of like that's rubbing me the wrong way when you're crumpling paper like that. And so that was the first of maybe the big things. The second of the big things was that the British had to pay a tremendous amount of money to fight the French and Indian War. And now that money was due. They felt like the colonies needed to take part in paying that money back. So what did they start doing to the colonies? Taxing them, right? And they had never done that before, okay? Because they pretty much let the colonies do what they wanted. They still made their money. Colonies, do what you want. And now they're telling the colonies, no, you're going to pay us some tax money. And the colonies said, that's outrageous. What was the first tax? Do you remember what they laid on them? The first one, Ashley?
No, sugar.
Yeah, the sugar act, sugar tax, which was like sugar, molasses, coffee, those sorts of things. Colonists kind of freaked out. They did what was maybe their favorite go-to when they got mad at the British. Yeah, they boycotted, right? And the reason why you would boycott, basically boycotting, is refusing to buy some product. So here, with a sugar tax and coffee and molasses, they would say, we're not paying the tax, which means we're not buying these products from you. Okay? And the idea is that by not buying products from them, then they're not making the money by selling that product. They're obviously not making any taxes either. So they get kind of pressured to drop the taxes. And the colonists had one main, I guess we're still talking what we were on Tuesday, but they had one sort of major complaint with these taxes, and that was this slogan that we've got up here on the board: no taxation without representation. And the colonists did not have representation where? In Parliament, right? Sort of think of like our Congress, right? The British had one of those. They called it Parliament. People would go there and debate the issues and make decisions about how they're going to handle things. The colonies did not have anybody in Parliament. So nobody spoke for the colonists, right? That would be like you guys making a decision for people that go to school in Sabika, right? The people in Sabika would be like, what the heck, right? You don't even, this doesn't even make sense. And that's what the colonists were saying. This doesn't even make sense. You guys are making decisions for us. We don't even have a say in it. So we don't like it. And that's where this slogan comes from. 2 guys, James Otis and Samuel Adams, were the 2 big guys initially behind this. So here's what they did. So in the colonies, when they would lay these taxes on them, the colonies together would like to have sort of a unified response. Okay, the British say, here's a tax. And the colonies as a whole would say, this is what we're doing. Okay, so how they kind of coordinated that was through something called committees of correspondence. Anybody know what correspondence is? Like, what would be a way of correspondence? To correspond with somebody. Yeah. Yeah, it's like communicating, right? How in these days would like people from New York communicate with people from Boston? Yeah. They actually didn't have phones in these days. Yeah, no, I'm in 1760s, 1770s. Well, okay. So how would they do it back then? Yeah, I mean, basically that's what they were left with, right? Is letters. And so these committees of correspondence, what they would do is they would come up with these ideas, like, all right, we've got this sugar tax that we don't like. How should we respond to it? So the people in New York would come up with ideas, the people in Boston would come up with ideas, people in Philadelphia would come up with ideas, and they'd correspond, they'd send their letters back and forth, and then they would come up with like a unified response. And initially that response was going to be the boycotts, right? Well, if they're going to tax us on this stuff, let's not buy the stuff. Then they won't get any taxes. And it actually was successful, right? So they had the sugar tax. Boycotts happened, and so the British government then said, well, okay, over time we're gonna sort of pull back on that sugar tax until it basically amounts to nothing. Okay, and that was in response to the boycotts. So colonists didn't like what happened. They boycotted. They were successful. So great, right? But for the British, they still had a problem. And what was still their problem? Yeah, they're in a tremendous amount of debt. So they still have to pay back that money. They still think that the colonists need to take part in paying that back. And so they think, well, the sugar tax didn't work, but obviously maybe a new tax would work, which obviously doesn't make any sense, right? But that's what they did. So they tried a new one. And this time they called it the Stamp Act. And what the Stamp Act did is it put a tax, not on sugar this time, but on like anything kind of that was made from like paper. So if you had newspapers, any kind of like legal documents, like say contracts or something, actual stamps, anything like kind of papery products, when you bought them, you had to get a stamp on it. And to get that stamp, that was the tax. So you paid for the stamp of the tax. So do you think for the colonists, they thought, well, we only need representation if you're trying to tax us on sugar. Any other kind of taxes, that's fine. We don't need to have representation, right? No. So they responded basically the exact same way that they did with the Sugar Act. And they started protesting it, right? Here's an old-timey, I guess that'd be a teapot, no Stamp Act. So they started protesting it right away. They did the boycotts again, but this time they also got a little more aggressive. And so Samuel Adams, who was no taxation without representation guy, started up, was one of the guys that started this group that was known as the Sons of Liberty. Okay? And what the Sons of Liberty did is they, instead of just boycotting, they got actually violent with some of these stamp collectors. Like today, when you go to a store and you buy something and there's a tax, it just sort of all happens automatically, right? This thing costs $5.99, but then you go and buy it and it's $6.42 because the tax is just automatically added, and they deal with all of it. Okay, you guys just pay it, but they, in the background is how it all goes everywhere. In these days, they actually had sort of tax collectors. They'd call them stamp agents. And so what Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty figured, they're like, we don't like this tax at all. This is no good. It's these guys, these stamp agents that are collecting the tax. We don't like paying it. So if we could somehow get these stamp agents to stop collecting the tax, then we won't have to pay it, right? And the way that they decided to do that was like through intimidation. This picture right here, it's kind of strange on the left. Does anybody know what's happening? Yeah. Yeah, it's called tar and feather, right? Which is not a safe thing, right? It's a pretty violent deal, but basically what happens is they would take a tax collector, they would dump hot tar. Has anybody ever messed around with hot tar or been around hot tar? Yeah, it's kind of horrifying, right? So they would take this hot tar, they would dump it on this stamp collector, and then, you'd have tar and all over, hot, burning. People could actually die from this. So you'd have this burning tar on your skin. And then they would take and dump feathers on top of you. So the feathers obviously would stick to this hot tar. So here you were, this poor guy, having tar with feather all this in a ton of pain. You look absolutely ridiculous, right? So that's one of the things that they would do. Yeah.
So why would you become a tax collector?
That's exactly what the Sons of Liberty were trying to do, right? They figured if we do this to the tax collectors are going to be extremely likely to maybe take some days off, right? So that they don't have this happen to them. And if they take the days off, or if they don't become a tax collector, a stamp agent, then we won't have to pay the tax. Awesome. Yeah.
Probably a better way to do that. Probably a better way to boycott the state collectors instead of just tarring them.
Yeah, it was kind of violent for sure.
Well, I see a rope in the back too on the tree.
Yeah, and that's actually the next story I'll tell you. This guy on the right, his name is try Andrew Oliver, and he was like the boss man stamp agent, like he was kind of the big boss guy. And so what happened was for him, out in front of his house, they took a bunch of these Sons of Liberty guys, a bunch of these protesters went in front of his house and hung a noose up in a tree, like that in the picture, and hung a, what would you call it? I guess like a dummy, a doll, that was meant to look like Andrew Oliver. Okay, so Andrew Oliver's in his house. Here you got all these rioters, I guess, out in front with a tree noose hanging, a thing that looks like Andrew Oliver. And then these Sons of Liberty guys say, gee, it sure would be a shame if something bad happened to you, Andrew Oliver. Something bad like that. We'd sure hate for that to happen. Boy, I wonder if you should maybe stop collecting these taxes so much, because we'd certainly hate for something bad to happen to you. And Andrew Oliver said, I think that's right. I don't think I'm going to do this anymore. So those were some of the ways that the Sons of Liberty, I don't want to say protested, because obviously that's more than protesting, but pushed back against these taxes, right? Is they got a little violent. And at the same time, in the background, we had the boycotts happening and all that normal stuff as well. So bottom line here, colonists not happy about the taxes. Here's a little video.
The British government responded to the protests over the Sugar Act by reducing the tax by 2/3. But they also enacted a new act called the Stamp Act. It required them to pay for tax stamps like this one that were put on paper goods such as almanacs, newspapers, and official documents. But the Stamp Act ended up causing even more trouble than the Sugar Act. Not only because the taxes on paper goods, high-cost taxation, had once again been enacted without colonial representation in Parliament. The Stamp Act really made people mad. It caused riots in colonial port cities, and a few government buildings were even destroyed. John Adams of Boston called for representatives from each colony to meet and come up with a plan for resisting unfair taxation. In the end, only 9 colonies participated. But what came to be called the Stamp Act Congress was a turning point in the movement toward independence, because the colonies discovered they had much greater strength when they acted as a group rather than separately. The Stamp Act was repealed the next year, but the government did not want to appear weak, and so before that law was repealed, the king approved a new law called the Declaratory Act. The purpose of this act was to make it clear to the colonists that the British government had the right to tax them as they saw fit, and the fact that the colonists were not allowed to have representation in Parliament did not change things at all.
All right, so Sugar Act happens, and the colonists don't like it. No taxation without representation. So they push back against it, do the boycotts, and the British government responds by basically doing what they want, right? Cutting the sugar tax way down. Then the British government tries again, this time with the Stamp Act. Colonists respond same way again with the boycotts, but then also groups like the Sons of Liberty sort of get pretty violent with some of the tax collectors and things. And so did you catch what they ultimately did with the Stamp Act, the British government? Yeah, it basically gave up. They used the word repeal, but that basically is what it means, got rid of. So the British government got rid of the Stamp Act. Okay, so you had colonists didn't like the Sugar Act, they got it cut way down. Colonists didn't like the Stamp Act, they got it repealed. So the colonists are sort of being successful, right? When the British government does something that they don't like, they push back. And up to this point, the British government has sort of buckled every time. Said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. Then this next part I think is kind of funny. I don't know if funny is the right word, but the British government did basically exactly what the colonists demanded, right? Every time so far. Sugar Act, Stamp Act, both times. But I guess they didn't want to have the colonists think that they were weak or something, because they did exactly what the colonists wanted them to do. But they passed this thing called the Declaratory Act, which basically said, okay, colonists, but don't forget, we're the boss of you. So colonists said, stop doing that with the Sugar Act, stop doing that with the Stamp Act, and the British government said, okay, we'll stop, but we're still the boss of you. So I always think that's kind of funny. I'll do exactly what you tell me to do, but just remember, I'm the boss. But I will do what you told me to do, which is, I thought that was kind of funny. I think that's kind of funny. Okay, so Sugar Act gone, well, mostly gone, 2/3 gone. Stamp Act gone. What isn't gone still for the British? Yeah, their debt. Right, yeah, exactly. So they still have to pay back this money, and they still believe that the colonists should take a part in paying it back. And how is the way that a government gets money from the people? Still through taxes. So they try again. I guess they think third time must be the charm. And so what they do is they pass a new set called the Townshend Acts. And this one has taxes on a bunch of different things. So there's taxes on like lead, paint, paper, glass, tea, all of those kind of things. So it's on taxes on more things. And then they did a few other things with that too. But the main thing was these new taxes. Do you think the colonists liked these ones? Said tax on sugar's terrible, a tax on stamps is bad, but a tax on these other taxes, though, that's fine. Just as long as it's not sugar and stamps. You think that's what they said? For sure not. They didn't like this either. So how do you think they responded? Well, they did boycotts again right away, right? That was kind of their favorite thing. This time, the Sons of Liberty didn't quite get as violent as they had before with the Stamp Act, but boycotts were the big thing. And so what the colonists would start doing is, instead of buying clothes or buying cloth, from the British, they would make their own. And tea was a big thing, British tea time, and these colonists were basically British people. So tea time was big for them, but they stopped buying British tea and started doing substitutes for tea. And they had homemade paper. If their house needed painting, they didn't paint it, right? So they boycotted those goods from the British to sort of push back again against those taxes. Here's this. Uh-oh.
This time the laws were called the Townsend Act. One of the acts imposed new taxes on colonists. Again, there were protests, because what Parliament was really saying was that Englishmen living in America didn't have the same rights as Englishmen living in England. In Boston, many of the protests were held at Faneuil Hall, where leaders like Sam Adams, whose statue now stands in front of the hall, called for a boycott of British goods. That meant that the colonists would not purchase anything made in England. They called their policy non-importation. Even though most colonial leaders hoped the protests would be non-violent, that wasn't always the case. Some colonists even went so far as to tar and feather customs officials who tried to collect the taxes. The protests paid off. Parliament repealed the Townsend Acts, and the taxes were lifted. But just so that they were still in charge, Parliament kept the tax on tea. They also sent more soldiers to Boston. Because of their uniforms, the people called them redcoats, or lobster backs. Eventually, it seemed as if Boston was a captured city ruled by soldiers.
Okay, so our big question, what's leading to the Revolutionary War? And we've got today, the big thing was all of these taxes that the British government was putting on the colonies. And the colonies' main beef, I guess, with that, main disagreement with those taxes was what? Said, you can't tax us because why? Ashley.
No taxation without representation.
Yeah, you can't tax us if you don't let us have representation in Parliament. And up to this point, the British government had said, we're going to tax you, and you're not getting any representation. So that's where we're going to end it. Anybody have anything?